Stephanie Schmidt. I'm a PhD candidate here at the Institute under the supervision of Allison, and among some of the other things I am doing, and my PhD, doing work with the MQPL and the teams in research that we've done in prisons is also part of my CV now. And I should also take this moment to thank everyone that's gone on with the MQPL research exercises, many of whom are included today. Some of the prisons that we've gone into, some of their representatives are here as well, and of course Catherine Otte, who is the MQPL queen at the Institute and has always been very supportive in our analyses along the way. So the MQPL, I'll get into in just a moment what this means, how we've developed it, and also what the plus represents. And I will, in some ways, argue that this is a form of research done differently, and especially within the prison setting. So just to give you an outline of what my presentation will cover today, I'll walk you through the measuring of quality of prison life for both prisoners and staff, how we've developed it, where we've used this exercise, and from there I'll discuss the ways in which this model of research is distinct and how it blends ethnographic intensity with substantial quantitative data collection. And this will lead into a brief appreciation for using slow science and slower science, and allowing the time to reflect and to understand organizational changes over time, which we are in the process of doing now. I will then present the findings from 3 recent MQPL exercises, 2 of which are prisons that we've been following now for 3 years. So to get into what the quality of life is, Allison mentioned it a bit earlier in her research and how it's been used in the high security estate. But over time, the PRC has developed 2 surveys which we use to measure the quality of prison life for both prisoners and for staff. They've been developed using the method of appreciative inquiry around what staff and prisoners have to say about what matters most to them. The prisoner survey has been taken on by the prison service as a way of measuring aspects of prison life that are often difficult to measure. For example, staff-prisoner relationships, respect, and safety. The strength of both surveys is that they were developed in consultation with the most relevant people. Long periods of time were spent talking to prisoners and staff about what matters most to them in a prison, living and working there. These discussions were then turned into a number of tick-box questions. The NOM's internal auditors conduct the MQPL for each prison in the country every 2 to 3 years, and the prison service has recently adopted the staff survey and is now conducting those in some selected prisons alongside the prisoner surveys. These surveys constitute a reliable method by which to measure prisoners' perceptions of prison life and to obtain a temperature gauge of a prison's social climate. They aim to redress the methodological and conceptual limitations of other prison evaluation techniques by grounding their development in lengthy and ongoing consultation with staff and prisoners. The MQPL and SQL are widely regarded as an efficient, conceptually well-informed, and carefully designed prison social climate measure. So now the actual survey structure. Again, each survey is 100 plus questions. Sometimes we do adapt them differently for each prison. The prisoner survey is made up of 21 dimensions organized into 5 categories, as shown here. The staff survey contains 18 dimensions organized into 4 dimensions, with 2 additional composite dimensions of punitiveness and traditional culture. The surveys are self-administered, and participants are asked to consider statements concerning their quality of life and rate them according to a 5-point Likert scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Factor analysis allows for the overall dimension score to be calculated as a mean of the composite item, and we'll talk a little bit more about scoring later as I show you some of the tables. In the last couple of years, the quality of life surveys have been used by researchers from around the world in a variety of ways. These are just some of the countries represented. And also, as Allison mentioned earlier, they've also been adapted for specific cultures. For example, John Rinn and his colleagues in Australia have adapted the prisoner survey for Aboriginal prisoners there. This leads us into what the MQPL Plus is. It's an intensive application of the staff and prisoner surveys and represents something more like a research ethos rather than simply a research methodology. We conduct about 3 of these exercises each year in specifically selected prisons. We typically spend about 1 week with a team of PRC researchers in the prison, penetrating all areas and spending considerable time engaging with prisoners and staff. The staff survey is distributed at an all-staff meeting after Ben or Allison introduces us, our work, and the importance of understanding how prison staff perceive their role in working life. Prisoner surveys are distributed in focus groups where prisoners are randomly selected for participation. And although survey completion is crucial to the analysis, we place an emphasis on dialogue and ensure that enough time is spent having meaningful discussions with prisoners about the strengths and weaknesses of their prison, how this impacts on their quality of life and progression, and ways this could be improved. After the collation of the quantitative data from the surveys and the qualitative data from interviews, fieldwork notes, observations, and commentary on the surveys, a final report is provided to the prison and followed by a feedback session, usually with senior managers and sometimes at a full staff meeting. We find that both staff and prisoners are always curious and eager about hearing the feedback and understanding how this information may be used in the future and improving the prison. These exercises began just a few years ago in 2011, first taking place in Brinsford Young Offenders Institution. From there it has grown, and as you can see, we've been very busy with it, having completed a total of 13 MQPL exercises over the last 4 years, 5 of these done in just 2014. You will also note that the range of prisons in which these have been conducted, from high security prisons to local Cat Bs, a Cat C now, and to young offender prisons. We've also included public and private prisons in this. What we think is particularly unique about MQPL exercises are their ability to go deep in a short amount of time and despite the use of a fairly long tick box questionnaire. The quality of life surveys represent an attempt to conceptualize and evaluate prison environments in ways that reflect and build on human experience through instilling value into survey form, and specifically identify relational, moral, and other qualities of those environments. The method is appreciative and is always in search of what matters most to staff and prisoners. Allison has recently noted that one of the leading problems of social science is achieving good enough measurement of complex human phenomena. The MQPL Plus model couples the strengths of qualitative and quantitative research through the synthesis of intensive ethnographic presence with a consistently reliable and valid measure of prison life. Our appreciative approach and spirit humanizes the research experience for both us and for prisoners and staff. As this prisoner in Oakwood recently observed, the research team was getting up close and personal with people, their lives, and their spaces. The ethnographic foundation of these exercises allows us to count the things that are not easily counted or measured when using traditional methods, or if we rely solely on the surveys alone. Rich in texture data is generated through our humane engagement and as rapport and relationships grow throughout the week we spend in the prison. This model of research is not just valuable to us as researchers, but is often genuinely appreciated by our participants, just as we discussed earlier. After MQPL Plus exercises, both prisoners and staff often express gratitude for taking the time to listen to them and their stories. Governors and senior managers have used these exercises and the feedback sessions as a springboard for better or deeper conversations with their staff about quality, care, decency, relationships, and ways in which better practice can be grown. I received a thank you card from the officer here who felt it to be beneficial to unload, reflect, and reevaluate their relationship with the job and the prison. In preparing this presentation, I too began to reflect upon the nature of MQPL and started to conceptualize it as a kind of living instrument that has the ability to evolve and adapt, all the while maintaining its internal reliability. As Allison discussed earlier, the nature nature of high-security prisons, for example, has necessitated new or altered measures in order to capture the nuance of these environments, much like the political charge mentioned. The survey allows for this flexibility, which strengthens its and our capacity to understand different prisons and populations. This is especially critical when attempting to continually identify what matters most to staff and prisoners as their prisons and the national context changes over time. As I momentarily lead us into the findings from some of our MQPL class exercises, I want to make a note about slower science practice and how we understand change trajectories in complex organizations, which has largely come out of doing these longitudinal MQPL plus exercises. Slow science is based on the belief that science should be a slow, steady, methodical process, and that scientists should not be expected to provide quick fixes to societal problems. Slower science supports curiosity-driven scientific research, which can often be antithetical to performance targets and modern expectations of outputs. Advocates of slowed-down scientific research argue that we as researchers require time to think, to digest, and at times, the time to fully comprehend what information we have, what we are missing, and time to recognize what it all means. The problem with understanding and interpreting organizational change, as James Jacobs notes in his introduction to Stateville, a classic text in prison sociology, is that prisons are dynamic and influenced by shifts in political, moral, and institutional environments, both inside and outside of the walls. Allison, too, argues that in order to reduce social distance in prison research, like we do in MQPL+, time must be allowed to develop, grow, and sustain this. Our prisons have undergone significant change and restructuring over the last several years, and it's still unclear what the outcome or long-term effects of this will be. That said, we are still unpicking this data, so it is a work in progress. So now we're going to move into the findings from some of these recent and longitudinal MQPL plus exercises, the first with Birmingham and Aylesbury. The PRC has done considerable research on public and private prisons and how they compare in terms of staff-prisoner relationships, professionalism, use of authority, and quality of life. This is just a selection of publications from the PRC. This was in part how we began a parallel 3-year study of a public and private prison using the MQPL+ to examine institutional changes over time. Research from Ben and Allison, as well as Susie Hulley and other PRC colleagues, have identified and empirically evidenced the core strengths and weaknesses of both private and public sector custodial models. Prison privatization in England and Wales was introduced in the early 1990s, and we now currently have 14 privately managed prisons. In a recent ESRC-funded study on public and private prisons conducted by Allison and Ben, there were several notable findings that highlight some of the complexities of understanding the role of for-profit prisons. In sum, the private prisons in their sample were at both ends of a quality continuum, some performing very well and some performing very badly. Poor performance was related to high staff turnover, low cost, inexperience, unstable management, location, and the speed of opening. At their best, private sector prison staff often have strengths in their cultural approach to prisoners, their innovation, their enthusiasm for rehabilitation, and in responsiveness to management, but they can sometimes find the professional use of authority much more difficult. For our 2 parallel sites in this 3-year study, we used HMP Birmingham and HMYY Aylesbury. We were initially invited into both of these prisons by their governors and at a time of change for both of them. Birmingham had just been transferred to the private sector 2 months earlier, and Aylesbury had a newish governor who was quite dynamic, therapeutically oriented, energetic, and was optimistic about reforming this historically poor young offenders institution through a range of engaging programming, like the User Voice Prison Council. I should also note that this very brave governor is in the audience today. I'd also like to note that I wrote this before I knew he was going to be here. These 2 prisons have some very obvious differences, specifically in their size and the population that they serve. but they have some significant similarities. Both the Victorian have long histories of poor performance and traditional and often resistant staff. Birmingham's transition from public to private was unique and groundbreaking in several ways, one of which was that the majority of their long-serving officers were transferred over. For Aylesbury, benchmarking began between the first and second visits and throughout both of those first periods of study. This prison was under threat of being closed or privatized, and I would describe this prison's ongoing status as considerably strained and in a staffing drought. As we moved through the periods of study, we developed a four-part figure, the skeleton of which is here, outlining the characteristics of good and poor public prison models and good and poor private prison custodial models. This helped us to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the prisons we were examining and how these compared to each other, as well as prisons previously and currently researched. So, it's a lot of words, but at the baseline level, at time 1, both Birmingham in 2011 and Aylesbury 2012 could be described using the public sector as a guide. These prisons were characterized more by the poor security custodial models of operation, exemplified by punitive staff attitudes, laziness, staff-oriented, a lack of engagement with prisoners, a hostility to outsiders, and restrictive regimes. At times, and amongst a small number of staff, some good traditional professional models of custody were exhibited. Experience and skill, seen through the good use of discretion and dynamic authority, as well as professional pride in their service and their prisons. So now we'll move into the Aylesbury findings. From there we'll move to Birmingham. So overall, Aylesbury scores remain consistently low and poor for all 3 years. However, at time 2, the qualitative data generated from the MQPL Plus seemed to indicate that there were positive shifts happening in the prison. According to both staff and prisoners, tensions and aggression on the wings had lessened, and relationships between all were improved, and the prison as a whole felt more relaxed. At this stage, we thought that the prison might be on the right track towards improvement. However, at time 3, which was earlier this year in the spring, the data indicated that this downward trend was persistent. Staff and prisoners rated their overall quality of life more negatively than at time 2, and feelings of resignation were expressed by both prisoners and staff. At time 3, one staff commented, "Staffing is far too low, massively affecting work that could be done with prisoners on all levels. More staff equals prisoners out more and doing meaningful work to help with their recovery. The environment is unsafe and for everyone, and staff seem complacent. There seems to be a lot of, we do it because we always have. How can you rehabilitate a person with minimal staff, minimal activities, and low morale?" It should also be noted that generally prisoner scores remain fairly stable, though low, over the 3-year period. A few notes about measurement, which Alison kind of touched on earlier. The quality of life measurement is quite sensitive, so even small fluctuations can flag significant change. All items are positively scored from 1 to 5, so anything above the neutral threshold of 3, which is highlighted in yellow, is good or positive. Anything below a score of 3 is poor or negative. So, for example, the drugs and exploitation dimension score, which is below the neutral line, indicates that there are high levels of bullying and available drugs in the prison. You can see that for prisoners, most dimensions did not change very much. When comparing the 2012 scores to 2014, only 9 out of 21 dimensions had moved in a positive direction, but some of the relational items did improve. These are the ones at the very beginning. You can see the green line is slightly above the other ones. A comparison of dimension mean scores from 2013 and 2014 revealed only one statistically significant difference. This was in organization and consistency. This had improved. And as one prisoner noted, last year in 2013, we never knew waking up what was going to happen. Now at least we know. When you know you're not getting stuff like association, you just get on with it. It's the not knowing that gets to you. Now we just don't get much at all, but at least there's a little bit more consistency. The limited regime the prisoner references was exacerbated at time 3, largely because of the lowered numbers of staffing that had been reduced over the past year. These are staff results. I hope they're fairly legible. I've highlighted the management dimensions for discipline and non-discipline staff over the 3 years. These staffing groups have shown different patterns over the period of study. Discipline staff, which are uniformed officers, their scores have steadily declined over the 3 years. Nearly all of these dimensions exhibited a negative linear trend. The items highlighted in red are statistically significant. Those in blue are also a linear trend, but not statistically significant. For non-disciplined staff, this includes administrative employees, probation, education, workshop, chaplaincy, PE, and other support staff. 18 out of 18 dimensions on the SQL received a higher rating in 2013 than in 2012. However, in 2014, only 1 out of 18 dimensions improved. All the others moved downwards. In other words, the non-disciplined staffing group showed an elbow pattern in which 2013 was their peak year, whereas disciplined staff were steadily declining. This pattern was consistent with the overall quality of life scores as well, shown at the bottom. This is the job satisfaction dimension, and again you can see the negative downward trend for disciplined staff for most of these. A noteworthy decrease here is in stress, highlighted in yellow. We don't often see dimension scores below 2, so this is noteworthy. For non-disciplined staff, relationship with the organization was the only dimension to exhibit a linear trend, and it moved in an upward or positive direction, though not statistically significant. This, again, for staff is the authority and prisoner orientation dimensions. You can see the negative downward trend for disciplined staff for most of these. An interesting finding here is the safety, control, and security dimension at the top, which moved from 2.57 in 2012 to a very low 2.04 in 2014. This was a common theme in the narratives of officers at time 3. Reduced staffing and high levels of sickness were creating elevated stress levels and fearfulness amongst staff. You will also note that nearly all of the prisoner orientation dimensions at the bottom moved in a downward direction. To sum up Aylesbury before we move on to Birmingham, this prison scores remained consistently low throughout the 3-year period. Officers have become increasingly stressed, and the prison as a whole is strained. However, despite the downward trend for disciplined staff, the prisoner scores remain fairly stable, with some of the harmony dimensions rising very slightly in a positive direction, and we'll return to this theme after Birmingham. So now moving on, this was our other 3-year site. Again, here's part of our private-public custodial characteristics figure again, this time showing what a good public and a good private model of custody look like. At the beginning of the transition period from public to private sector for Birmingham, it was thought that this unique development could, if successful, could lead to a significant improvement in the culture and the quality of life at the prison by combining some of the strengths of the public sector staff and Birmingham at its best, highlighted in blue, with some of those of the private sector, like more efficient staff deployment, a clearer vision, and innovative and capable management. At time 1, Birmingham was performing at the low end of the quality continuum and was comparable to one of the worst or lowest performing prisons in the country. Much like Aylesbury, this prison had very experienced but cynical staff who were resistant to change. Although there was low trust in the senior management team, they were willing to give the new director a chance. At time 2, though, some significant improvements in prisoners' scores were seen, particularly in the relational dimensions like respect. For staff, the eagerness for change and willingness to adopt a new agenda had waned from time 1, as staff reported feeling fatigued and bruised from multiple alterations to their working practices and their numbers, with too little support and leadership along the way. Staff were emotionally fraught at the time of the second research visit, and their scores reflected this. So what we saw at the end of time 2, Birmingham had not yet successfully combined the strengths of both public and private sector prison staffing and management models, and instead we're displaying some of the worst aspects of both, shown here in blue. Punitive attitudes towards prisoners was more prevalent. Laziness and lack of engagement had been aggravated by staff's reactions to their reduced numbers. Many retreated, and collective huddling in offices was common. Perceived threats to their safety dominated conversations and interviews at that time. Staff felt powerless, and policing and security of the wings had waned significantly. But then, much to our surprise, at time 3, the findings showed a marked improvement for both prisoners and staff. Staff had regained some of their confidence, and job security was no longer a pressing issue for them. Most scores were better than at time 1 and time 2. The director had found his footing and done considerable work with prisoners and staff around accountability, empowerment, and giving Birmingham a vision towards a better and different working model. This table shows the prisoner results for the harmony or relational dimensions at all 3 points of the study. You can see that overall prisoner scores improved even when disciplined staff were at their lowest in 2012. In total, a linear trend analysis showed that 7 out of 21 prisoner dimensions moved in a positive direction and at a significant level. 5 of these were harmony dimensions, shown here, suggesting that relationships in particular have undergone the most significant improvement since the transition from public to private sector. Though still at the lower end of a quality continuum, these are notable improvements and in such a short amount of time. This is the visual representation of the 3-year prisoner results. In addition to the harmony dimensions, there were 2 other dimensions that improved at a statistically significant level. These are fairness, right here in the middle, and also personal autonomy at the end. These are staff results for management dimensions. These showed a very different pattern than prisoners. For staff, their results showed a distinct elbow shape in that at time 2, there was a significant drop in scores, which then rose back up at time 3. The only dimension that moved in a linear pattern for all staff was relationship with peers, which improved over the 3 years. Because of this pattern, the next couple of tables will compare time 1 and time 2, and then time 2 and time 3. When we look at this comparison of management dimensions in 2011 and 2012, you can see that every score went down at time 2. Attitudes towards the director and the overall quality of working life scores at a statistically significant level. Now you'll see the comparison of 2012 to 2013, all of which moved in a positive direction, and all significantly so. Overall, most staff scores in 2013 received a higher rating than at both time 1 and time 2. 17 out of 18 staff dimension scores improved from 2012 to 2013. The only one that did not improve, interestingly enough, was dynamic authority. The overall quality of working life also improved from 5.52 in 2011 to 4.47, and then back up to 5.93. These are more staff results for job satisfaction dimensions. Again, you can see the distinct elbow pattern. All of these scores improved from 2012 to 2013. There are some noteworthy findings here in understanding how staff perceived their new and changing working lives. Relationship with G4S improved significantly, but was still below the time 1 rating of 3.10, and still quite low overall. Commitment 2 received a more favorable rating in 2013 compared to 2012, but was still not as high as the 2011 score of 3.64. In conversations, most staff expressed loyalty and commitment to their prison and their service, though these relationships were complex. The staff were not wedded or necessarily dedicated to G4S, and in some ways felt betrayed by the prison service. 2 very positive shifts were in recognition and personal efficacy and involvement and motivation, both of which received their highest ratings in 2013. To some extent, these are positive characteristics seen in private sector custodial models, indicating that the new ways of working at Birmingham were empowering staff to use creativity and innovation in their roles while feeling supported and recognized when doing so. Relationships with peers has been both a positive and negative feature of Birmingham. Too much cronyism, especially amongst officers, can lead to bullying, collective resistance, and negative orientations towards other staffing groups like managers, which is what we witness at time 2. However, for many staff in this prison, these relationships brought resiliency, and many described this as a survival tool through the extensive transitional process. As I noted earlier, Ben and Allison's research on private and public prisons indicated that staff in private prisons often find the professional use of authority more difficult. We were curious to see how this would interact with the Birmingham environment, since most of their long-standing public sector staff had been carried over. These are the authority and prisoner orientation dimensions. Perhaps the most notable finding here is at the top: safety, control, and security dramatically improved from 2012 and was even higher than at time 1. Also of interest is the loss of some of their dynamic authority, which I mentioned earlier, which remained at a constant level in 2012 and 2013, though still lower than at 2011 at the baseline level. Much like Aylesbury, when staff were at their lowest, orientations towards prisoners became more negative. This was particularly evident with disciplined staff. It seems that as staff found greater satisfaction in their working environment and perceptions of safety improved, orientation towards prisoners became more positive. You can see that professional support and relationships with prisoners improved significantly, and the scores are higher than they were in 2011. The last of the findings for Aylesbury and Birmingham are these additional composite measures of punitiveness and traditional culture. Both of these dimensions are associated with resistance to change and a tendency to use coercion. This table shows disciplined staff scores for traditional culture over the 3 years and with a linear trend analysis. Traditional culture represents negative orientation towards both prisoners and managers. Some of the items contained in this measure are: the level of power prisoners have in this prison is too high, and I trust the senior managers in this prison. You can see that Birmingham scores reflect the same elbow pattern that the other dimensions displayed, in that there was a significant drop at time 2. For Aylesbury, their downward linear trend was statistically significant, and again indicating that as staff felt greater levels of stress and unease in their working environment, their orientation towards management and prisoners became more negative. This is the punitiveness dimension, which represents feelings of cynicism and resentment towards prisoners. Some of the items contained in this measure are: the adjudication system in this prison doesn't teach prisoners anything, and most prisoners are decent people. Again, Birmingham scores have the time to dip, but do not shift as much as traditional culture. Aylesbury's scores show a slight downward but non-significant linear trend. So, now, moving on. This is Oakwood. This was our most recent MQPL exercise, which took place just a few months ago. This is a sneak peek. We are quite literally just starting to analyze this data, so it's a little bit rough around the edges. For those of you who don't know Oakwood, it is the largest prison in England and Wales, holding 1,600 adult men. It's a Cat C training prison, so that's a lower security prison, and it's located in West Midlands. It's a brand new prison that is privately managed, and it opened in 2012. It's been under considerable media scrutiny in the past year, or well, maybe since its opening. So it's faced a number of challenges since opening day. I have the pleasure of shadowing NOMS employees do the first Oakwood MQPL in October of last year. At this time, they surveyed just over 100 prisoners, which is the blue line shown there. I brought a team of researchers in August in 2014. We surveyed 224 prisoners, and those results are shown by the red line. As you can see, there's some considerable difference. In 2014, 20 out of 21 dimensions improved, and 1 remained the same, which was family contact. 18 out of 21 of these improved at a significant level, including the overall quality of life score, which moved from 4.01 to 5.24. These are notable results, especially when we consider the infancy of the prison and the challenges it's faced since opening. For example, having a predominantly young and inexperienced officer group, especially when they first opened the prison. These are the staff results for 2014. When NOMS visited last year, they did not conduct a staff survey, so we only have one set, 1 year's worth of data for staff. This is for all the staffing groups, all staff, discipline, non-discipline, and managers, and just for the authority and prisoner orientation dimensions. I chose to highlight these dimensions because they, in some ways, exemplify the strengths and weaknesses of both the private and public sector custodial models. All items in yellow are scored above a 3, the neutral threshold. And what's particularly interesting here is the comparison of discipline staff and managers. These groups typically rate their quality of working life very differently, managers at a much higher or positive level. So if we highlight just discipline staff and managers, you'll see that discipline staff have rated each of these items more positively than managers. This is unusual, and we're not quite sure, at least at this stage, what it means. But this trend was not just isolated to these dimensions. 12 out of 18 staff dimensions were rated more positively by discipline staff than managers. Most significant was the difference in ratings for attitudes towards the director. Discipline staff scored this at 3.55, managers at 3.05. And finally, or maybe not finally, one more people. This graph shows the different staffing groups. Usually we see very clearly defined stratification with managers at the very top, non-disciplined staff somewhere in the middle, and disciplined staff at the very bottom. I think this is quite a nice visualization, and I've been thinking about this graph all morning and what this could mean, but you'll have to stay tuned for that. This is Oakwood disciplined staff compared to other Cat C prisons that are comparable. And again, just for the authority and prisoner orientation dimensions. Generally, Oakwood is in line with the others, though somewhat low in safety, control, and security, and dynamic authority. Interestingly, Oakwood, the only private prison in this group, scores higher than the others in professional support for prisoners and relationships with prisoners. So to conclude and summarize, what we know is that Birmingham, in this 3-year span, has improved, and in some ways remarkably so. It is still a lower performing prison compared to others, and it's unclear how much the privatization process impelled these changes. For Aylesbury, despite having a dynamic and energetic governor, the benchmarking process has had a detrimental effect on disciplined staff in particular, their orientation towards prisoners, their quality of working life, and their perceptions of safety, control, and security. Prisoners here are consistently rating their overall quality of life as poor. The key lessons here are that protracted means of organizational change. For Birmingham, this was the bid process and transition from public to private. And for Aylesbury, this has been the ongoing implementation of new ways of working with staffing and resource reductions. This brings risks. Competition and staffing reduction can lead to turbulence, like at Aylesbury, and fair processes are necessary. However, some of this change can bring about positive improvements, as we have seen at Aylesbury in quality and culture. Clear messages should be communicated to staff about what needs preserving during these times of changes, what needs changing, what needs to be preserved, and the vision in which their new staffing arrangements are based. However, even with a strong, dynamic, and visionary leader at Aylesbury, the national agenda has impeded his ability to follow through with or maintain some of the positive aspects of this unique prison and what it has to offer its young offenders. There are further important research lessons to be learned, including the explanation for cultural change, which, as we've seen, can be rapid and unstable. longitudinal studies of changes in prison quality and management are essential in moving forward. The nature of our current climate in prisons and the prison system and the shifting ways in which economics and politics are shaping this landscape are important for understanding how prisons and policies change. And as I've discussed today, understanding long-term organizational change takes time, reflection, and appropriate ways of conceptualizing and measuring these changes.